In this video, Jordan Peterson explains what prevents people from reaching their full potential.
But anyways, they've laid out the problem. This is the problem. So all of a sudden people woke up. And when they woke up, they noticed who they were. And they weren't happy about it. So what did they notice? They're naked. Okay. Well, so what? Well, you see so what instantly, because the first thing they do is make fig leaves. And they make a clothing out of fig leaves and cover themselves up. Well, that's culture. And you think, well, what's good? What is the utility of culture? Well, that's easy. Culture is the barrier between us and our own nakedness. It's the barrier between our nakedness and the natural world. It's like, why do you put on clothes? So you don't freeze to death, so that you're not as easily attacked. It's like as soon as you know you're naked and vulnerable and you're self-conscious, you extend yourself across time, you've discovered time, you know that not only are you vulnerable now, but you're going to be vulnerable in the future, and so are your children and their children. It's like the whole nature of being, it's like you've added a dimension to the nature of being. You've added time to it. And it's a radical transformation. You might say, well, that's good because lions don't eat you as often. It's like, yeah, the zebras don't seem that upset on the plains of the Serengeti when the lions are around. One's going to pick one off now and then. But the zebras aren't running around, with anxiety disorders, popping Valium all the time because the lions are there. But that's not the case with human beings. We see a lion and we think, oh yeah, at some point that lion's going to want to eat one of us. And lions in general will do that. So not only do we have to solve the problem of that lion right now, we have to solve the problem of all lions for all time, which we actually seem to be doing a very good job of now, because soon there won't be any of them. But, so that sort of thing can get out of hand. But you get the point. So, okay. So they sewed fig leaves together and they made themselves aprons. The sexual element of it too is, I think also, that the reason sexuality is tied in there so tightly is because the most sexual parts of a human being are also the parts that are the most vulnerable. So it's not only, vulnerability to judgment and vulnerability to exploitation, which is a huge deal, especially in the case of women. But it's also the fact that, just from a purely physical perspective, those are the most delicate tissues. And so the fact that they're fully exposed is really a big problem. So, okay, so now they're naked. They've got aprons on. It's like, they're not in unconscious paradise anymore. So then what happens? And they heard the voice of the Lord God walking in the garden in the cool of the day. And Adam and his wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord God amongst the trees of the garden. I can't imagine how you could possibly pack more meaning into two sentences. You can tell people have been at this for like 25,000 years. Because see what happens here is that there's an idea to begin with that there's a complete unity between God and his creation, let's say. So that the natural order is undisturbed. And all of a sudden that's fractured. And so what happens is that human beings are divorced from the divinity. And not only are they divorced from it, they're unwilling to expose themselves to it. So think about this. You might say, well, imagine that you could exist in a manner that was nigh on perfect. The question might be, well, what would stop you from doing it? Well, one thing might be that you couldn't envision something as useless as you are actually managing that. So if you think about what stands in the road of people as obstacles to their full self-realization, the easiest way to encapsulate that is that they view themselves as inadequate. Now, there's other things as well. They don't want to take the responsibility and so forth. But, it's very difficult to heed a divine call, let's say, when you're stuck in this little ratty contraption that is prone to disease and prone to shame and prone to age and prone to death. And it's like, how can you continue in some divine manner when you've come to the realization that there you are? And people derive the conclusion fairly frequently that they're so appalling that it would be better if they were obliterated along with everyone else. It's not as if the realization of the nature of our own physical being was something that freed people up to be courageous. It was quite the reverse, although I think people can still be courageous in front of it, in spite of it, but it's definitely in spite of it. All the classic definitions of true courage aren't that you're not afraid, it's that you're afraid but you do it anyways. It's like, well, that fear and shame is an integral part of you as soon as you realize that you're vulnerable to social evaluation and natural degeneration. You're stuck with it. And so then, bang, you're divorced from your divine mode of being, we'll say, partly at least because you're just afraid to manifest it. So anyways, that's what happened. So Adam and Eve hide from God. Now that seems to be really counterproductive, because you might think that if they didn't hide from God, then there wouldn't be a problem. They could be naked and no problem, but that isn't what happens. And the Lord God calls unto Adam and says unto him, where are you? And Adam says, I heard your voice in the garden, so there's a call there. And I was afraid because I was naked. Well, that pretty much explains it. And I hid myself. Okay. And God said, who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten of the tree whereof I commanded thee that thou shouldest not eat? Who told thee that thou wast naked? I believe women told men that. I think that's a very accurate summation of the relationship between men and women. Well, we develop consciousness across the span of evolutionary history. And I believe it for a couple of reasons. Number one, sexual selection is a huge factor in what created human beings. And women primarily do the selection. They're the bottleneck. And they're the bottleneck because women can't have that many offspring. They can only have a few. So that makes them the bottleneck by definition. And women are so choosy about men that twice as many women have children as men. Okay, so what that means is, on average, means that, I know it's kind of hard to understand, but imagine every single woman has one child. And then imagine half the men have 0 and half of them have 2. Okay, that's the case. So statistically speaking, half of all men were write-offs. Now it's actually worse than that, because some men have so many offspring that it's not even funny. So that cuts it. It cuts the number of successful men down by many. So women are a bottleneck, and they do judge men, and rightly so, and they judge them according to their insufficiency. And that is what makes men self-conscious, obviously. And it's the thing that makes them more self-conscious than anything else. Now, to men's credit, let me tell you about the bowerbirds, okay? So bowerbirds, they're very cool. They live on the ground. And the males make these incredibly, first of all, they weave a nest that's sort of like a hammock. It's real soft. And then they hang that in a tree. And then they sweep out their front yard, and then they decorate it with bits of, like, the blue leaves are over here, and then there's some red leaves here, and there's a nice display of green here, and maybe there's some glass there. And it's like this little artwork. And the bowerbirds have these more or less in a row, say in the same territory, and then the females come hopping along and they take a look at this thing. And if they like it, well, then they're willing to become a little more friendly with that particular bowerbird, and if they don't, they fly away. Well, so if the male bowerbird has 3 female visitors and nothing pans out, then he has a little fit and erases his whole creation. Then he has to do another one. And so, you just have to think about that for 15 minutes, and it pretty much explains human beings. It's like, men, one response that men could have had was just to go hide in a shell, and some of them do that. That is absolutely a common response, and to never come out and spend the rest of their lives playing video games in the basement and eating Cheetos, But then, the other response is, well, I better transform myself into something that isn't going to produce that response. And that's a central part of male motivation. It's a central element of male motivation. So if you're ever wondering why men are the way they are, the real answer to that is because that's how they evolved to impress women. So, because obviously, if that wouldn't have happened, given that sexual selection is such a powerful selecting force among human beings, well, it wouldn't have worked out. So women did make men self-conscious.